And I do want to welcome everyone again to the webinar, 3 Reasons Performance Appraisals Don't Improve Performance. So I am Dwight Mahalitz. I'm President of Effective Managers, and I will be discussing this with you today. This is the statement that I would like to start with, and the statement is that performance appraisal is often not the same as performance management. I will walk through what I mean by this and why it's important to managers and to organizations in terms of the way that we do our business. I will then come to the 3 reasons, which is part of the title that I've demonstrated, and then close with a few tips. Well, in terms of performance appraisal, in most organizations, in my life as a manager for a couple of decades, a little bit plus, and as a management consultant, it's really seen as a human resources system. So this system requires a session that's held once a year, where each employee is assessed on their performance during the year. In that session, employees are usually rated on the attainment of certain objectives. Those objectives might have been set earlier in the year. There's usually some process to determine what those objectives are. So in other words, what are the change objectives, the things that someone should be focusing in on during the year. And there's generally a section on competency, so how well they did their job in terms of the way they do their work and what's required in their position. This system is almost always tied to compensation. I can't think of an example where it's not. So how well someone does at this performance appraisal session in terms of the assessment will determine their merit increase in the position that they currently hold. And this one always gets me, but they're almost always marked on a curve. So there will be guidelines coming out that for each manager, only a certain percentage of employees can be rated at a certain level in terms of the performance system. So only a certain number can be rated as above average. The research that I've found that's the absolutely most interesting, and as those of you that have attended a number of my webinars find that I always try to ground this in some scientific basis. This research was done by the Corporate Leadership Council. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's the world's leading member-based advisory company. So it is a private sector company. They take membership from senior leaders. They currently have about 16,000 members, and that represents 10,000 organizations in 110 countries. And their mission is to advance the science and practice of management. So they come up with some really good stuff. But this research study that they did in 2002 is bang on the topic that we have today, because they looked at the effectiveness of over 100 performance drivers. In the study that they carried out, as you can see, it's substantive. 19,000 employees, 34 different companies, in 29 countries. The key finding, and where I'll be focusing later today, is that fairness and accuracy of informal feedback increased performance by more than 35%. So think about that. In the situation, out of these 100-odd performance drivers that they looked at, this one alone, that if feedback between the manager and the direct reports of that manager is fair and accurate, in those organizations, they found that performance was 35% higher than organizations where that was not the case. If you go down to the last bullet on this page, this is the one that I found amazing. Recognizing and rewarding achievement through a formal performance appraisal system in itself actually reduced performance by 1%. So the takeaway that I have from this one is that in most organizations, we have allowed the managerial function of performance management, which is critical and which can have, as we saw, a 35% impact on performance, to be undermined by the corporate system of performance appraisals. So the 3 reasons why performance appraisals, or the corporate HR system of performance appraisal, if you will, fail, are these 3. And this is an article that I published on the web, which was actually quite well read, and one of the reasons I decided to do a webinar on this topic. The first one is that ongoing feedback is necessary. So it's not enough to have that once a year performance appraisal session. The job of a manager is to interact with their employees in a number of ways and giving them feedback in terms of their performance, what's going well, what's not going well, coaching them in terms of doing better, rewarding them when they're doing well, even if it's a pat on the back and a hooray at a staff meeting, is critically important to management. So performance management then is part of a manager's job. The second one is that feedback must be accurate and timely. So accurate goes without saying. And in any life relationship, accuracy is absolutely, we can call it truth if you will, but being accurate is absolutely critical. And the timely is also there. It's not good enough to, at the end of the year, say you did these three things great and you did these three things not so great, because by that point in time, you'll be lucky if the employee can even remember those incidents. So the feedback as part of that management system needs to be accurate and timely. And the third one, and this one wasn't referred to in the research, but I feel strongly about this one, is that formal performance appraisal systems seek objectivity. So there's this kind of almost overwhelming need in the HR system to be, quotation marks, objective in the way that performance appraisals are carried out and in the way people are treated. And I would distinguish this objectivity from fairness. And I think there's been some confusion around those two terms. Of course, we want to treat people in our organization fairly, and we want to treat them in a similar fashion so that everybody feels that they have been treated fairly. And that's translated into objective systems. So if every manager walks through this form, ticks these boxes, gives this feedback in exactly this way, then we're going to be fair to our employees because every manager is absolutely objective. I will come back to this because this is a really important one, but I think things have gone off the rails quite significantly as a result of some of that thinking. So how do we build in this fair and accurate and timely feedback to employees? So the first is that we need to have this foundation, and there are 5 things that all managers must do to be successful in their work. I have a series of articles on the web under this title, The 5 Requirements of Effective Managers, and I have a webinar scheduled later this fall on specifically this topic. So here I won't go into a lot of detail except to list them. So the first one is that an effective manager needs to plan. And that plan needs to be within the context of their manager's plan, and that has to be within the context of the overall strategy. So my plan as a manager needs to link through and be a sub-plan of my manager's plan, if you will, but there needs to be that straight line of sight from my plan all the way back to the strategic plan of the organization. Once that plan is in place, then I can decide and do my value-added work. So what are those things that I, as a manager, in my position, with my capability, must do for success for that task? So this is the key linchpin of my plan in terms of implementing it. But then with regard to the plan and all those things I need to accomplish, what's the stuff that I can delegate? Well, that would be whatever's left over. So in doing that, you can set the context and the boundaries for all of your employee team. So part of the context is what your plan is, part of the context is what you're planning on doing personally, and part of the context is how they will need to work together as a team and what they need to accomplish. That leads then to the specific delegation where you delegate in terms of quality, quantity, timeliness, for each individual, so you have very specific objectives that they're accountable for. And then this 5th one is the establishment of the feedback loops. So the topic today is really kind of varying back and forth between all of these, because the feedback loop in terms of performance management links to all of these, because it's hard to manage performance if you haven't delegated appropriately. It's hard to delegate if you haven't planned, and so on. So that's why I wanted to start with this slide, and enough said on that one. The second foundational piece that I wanted to lay out is this finding that we had from our research that we partnered with the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. And our finding there is managers only spend 55% of their time doing value-added work. So that means they're spending 45% of their time on stuff that's not relevant to the work that they need to accomplish as a manager. And there's two aspects to this value-added work. One part of it is what I talked about in the last slide, those things that only they in their position with their capability can do. Part of their value-added work is doing the managerial work, so the delegation, the coaching, the feedback, setting the objectives, the delegation, and all of that. So managerial work has the two components to it, and if managers are only able to spend 55% doing that, the difficulty is that they may be distracted from doing the key managerial work in terms of setting objectives and providing the feedback that's necessary. So on to the three reasons. I'd like to talk a little bit about each one of those three, and then when we've done that, I'll have some sort of wind it up in terms of an approach that can be used in organizations. So in terms of feedback, it's not a nice to have. I think I've made that point in the slides leading up to this, and in fact it's critically important, and it's an essential and an ongoing part of management. There's a real risk that managers skip this step. I put on the slide, my people know what to do. And in my experience, the higher in the organization that you go, the easier it is to fall into this trap. So if you're the CEO of the organization, it's fairly easy to rationalize to yourself that my senior vice presidents, have 20 plus years experience. They know this job inside out, so they know what to do. So they don't need feedback from me. But in terms of that manager-subordinate relationship, that feedback is critical no matter where in the organization you're situated. So the CEO does need to be really clear in terms of delegating work to their direct reports, and they also need to be very clear in terms of giving them feedback on what's going well, what's not going well, and what can be improved. And the reason this is important is that if those feedback loops aren't provided, then with goodwill, individuals will make decisions and take initiatives that will start to drift away from the core clear direction that the manager needs to set. The third is that feedback includes and supports the other aspects of management. So each of those 5 requirements are supported by feedback. So if I'm giving context to my direct report, understanding their situation, what some of their difficulties are, the challenges they face, which is the second half of the feedback loop, is very helpful to me in terms of clarifying that context. If when I'm delegating, I can understand what the impact of that delegation is going to be on their priorities, understanding the conflict that might raise if I introduce a new priority midway through the year. All of these things are very important for me as a manager to understand so that I can be clear in terms of how this particular delegation fits in with all of the other things that people are responsible for. The feedback needs to be two-way. I think I've demonstrated that in the first 3 bullets here, is that there can be a temptation when you're the boss to say, this is what needs to be done, just do it. I'm sorry I don't have time to really get into details with you. Is a shortcut. I would call that a use of power instead of a use of authority. So it's a misuse of authority because the manager cannot possibly delegate appropriately without understanding and getting feedback from the direct reports. And then the feedback loops, I've talked mostly in the one-on-one, but it's also really important that you have those between the manager and the team as well. So the manager is setting context for and receiving feedback from the team as a whole, and each individual within the team is also in place on a separate basis. So this is part of building the team and ensuring that people are all on the same page in terms of the work that they need to do, but also the work that they need to do with respect to each other. The second reason is around the accuracy and the timeliness of feedback. So not only is feedback necessary, when and how you do that feedback is also critically important. So first of all, it needs to be fair. So the employee, when they're receiving the feedback, needs to know that you have their best interest at heart, and needs to know that from your perspective, you're trying to not only improve the way they do things, but it's in the interest of the organization as a whole. The feedback needs to be accurate. So this is where the two-way communication is really important. So giving the bad news is equally as important as giving the good news, and if it's accurate, the employee will absolutely be able to understand the purpose for the feedback. And it needs to be timely. It needs to be given in the right time frame for the employee. I talked about different levels in the organization a bit before, and that this has an impact on timeliness of feedback. So if I'm a senior vice president and I'm reporting directly to a CEO, I'm not going to need feedback on a day-to-day basis, certainly. While I made the point that you do need that feedback, it can be in terms of the job that the SVP has. So something they're accountable for might be going out 3, 4, 5, or even 6 years. So the CEO needs to be aware of the progress of that particular deliverable and to be able to give feedback on it, but it might be more of a quarterly update than it is a daily meeting. On the other hand, at the front end of the organization, where frontline workers are working on a day-to-day basis, they do need that daily feedback. So they will come in the morning, they're given the work, it's assigned, they need to turn it around during the day, and then will be finished that work within that same day. So the first frontline manager having feedback and giving them session in that particular day is important. So the timeliness needs to be a judgment call of the manager with respect to how often and how frequently that feedback should be in place. I have this other little nugget of research for you that in the research we just completed, only 46% of managers are receiving feedback in what they consider to be a timely way. So as organizations, as managers of organizations, we can do better. And the third one, this is the one that I alluded to at the beginning, is that performance management systems tend towards objectivity and tend to go too far in terms of objectivity. And I start with the question, what is objectivity? So objectivity is an intent to remove subjectivity, the opposite of objectivity, from a process. So if I'm in that's a pharmaceutical company, and I'm a bench chemist, and I'm performing a quality assurance test, that absolutely needs to be objective. So we need a procedure, we need a checklist, we need training, we need coaching, so that that test is conducted exactly the same way each time, and the bench chemist is likely to just tick off marks that this was done, this was done, this was done, this was done, and that's the quality control in terms of objectivity. So for something like that, objectivity absolutely makes sense. For a performance management system and the performance appraisal system, fairness is absolutely needed, and we need to have systems in place to assure fairness and quality in terms of the nature of that work. But by trying to make it objective, we take away the ability of the manager to use their judgment. So an example that I like to use in this is in the sales environment. I forget where I first heard this example, but it absolutely fits. So if you have two salespeople, and they each have a target of selling, 57 widgets. So these widgets are really big things, and they're really expensive. So each quarter you're supposed to sell 57 of them. So if salesman A sells 40 and salesman B sells 80, which one is doing the better job? So if you had a totally objective system, you would be ticking the box and saying, well, the one that sold 80 widgets is doing a better job than the one that sold 40 widgets. But what happens if salesperson A, who only sold 40 widgets, is in a territory where there's been the main purchaser of widgets recently closed their facility, and that salesperson is now accountable for redeveloping the territory and finding new clients. So in that situation, the ability to sell 40 widgets might have required superhuman effort, whereas the person who sold the 80 might have been in a very developed territory, and there was a huge expansion of the client, and they needed to buy, I don't know, whatever, a huge supply of them, and therefore could have met the target, working half time. So just a simple example, but to show that this subjectivity is really important, because the manager needs to have the ability to use their judgment to determine who's doing well in the environment within which they need to operate. So objectivity can actually detract from the perceived fairness of the feedback, because if you just ticked 80 widgets better than 40 widgets, the person that sold the 40 is going to be pretty upset in terms of the way the organization has treated him or her. So those are the three reasons why I believe performance appraisal systems do go off track and why they're not as effective as they could be. And I just wanted to come back to this other little bit of research. This is from an article that was published by James Heskett in 1994. Those of you on the line that have been at a couple of my previous webinars know that I like this study and have probably seen this slide before. But I really want to reemphasize that in terms of organizational success, so driving profit and the lifetime value of a company, we often think about employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, and revenue leading to increased profit. What we tend to forget is Heskett's fundamental point is that managerial and leadership practices undermine the employee satisfaction component. So performance management then becomes critically important, because on the one hand, you're helping people to understand how to do better, therefore to be more productive, but you're also helping people to feel appreciated in their work and driving employee satisfaction in that way. Because as a manager, if you can create a situation where individuals can use their full capability and feel that their work is valued and receive that fair and timely or accurate and timely feedback, then they're much more likely to be satisfied in their job, and that is going to transfer and translate to the bottom line. So I had a few thoughts then around performance management in terms of how we think about performance management. Performance appraisal as a system tends to be more narrowly defined than this. So I would encourage you to broaden your thinking around performance management and think of it as a system that is used to, as I have in these sub-bullets, to set context, to delegate objectives to individuals, then to measure achievement and performance against those objectives. So it's not only what you got done, but it's how you got it done, to provide that feedback to employees. And yes, in many ways it is linked to compensation and should be, because those employees that are more productive should be rewarded more highly than those who are less productive. One hint I would have for you, though, is to the extent that you can in your organization, try to separate the compensation meeting from the actual formal documenting of the annual performance meeting. So in that performance meeting, which is held once a year, so to reemphasize, the performance management and the feedback has to be ongoing and timely throughout the year. I can understand why organizations do need to have that one annual formal meeting where the results and the discussions of the year are documented. I think, in terms of performance, that's fair. So in that meeting, it's a good time to review the year, to talk about next year's objectives, perhaps review the position description, bring it up to date, and so on, and to summarize all of the performance feedback sessions that you've had during the year. Have that meeting, focus in on the work, focus in on the individual, focus in on how things can be improved, focus in on how they're doing really well. And then in a separate meeting, talk about the annual merit increase and the cost of living increase, if there is one. And what that does is takes away the stressor of the compensation discussion, which from the discussion of the employee satisfaction. Each one of those can be stressful enough, so why combine the two into one meeting? So at the bottom line, then, performance management is really about how well work is done, and it does need to start at the top of the organization with the CEO managing subordinates to the CEO, and then that cascades all the way down the organization to the front line. So summary thoughts. It's important to establish timely and appropriate feedback sessions for the team and for each individual. If you have a regularly scheduled meeting, which I do recommend, don't wait for those meetings if something good or something not so good happens. It's really critically important to have that conversation, the good ones and the tough ones, as close as possible to the actual event. And, I already talked about this one. So separate the compensation meeting from the formal performance appraisal session. I'm down to the last 3 slides. In terms of ensuring that managers are as effective as possible, I did want to talk just a few seconds about the Effective Managers Survey. This survey was developed coming out of the research that we did with the Telfer School of Management, and it's an absolutely fabulous tool for CEOs to understand how effective their managers are and where things may be going astray in terms of managers being effective or not. So I would be delighted to talk with any of you about this tool and how it might apply in your organization, and I've certainly got a lot written about it on my website. So if you're thinking about doing an employee engagement survey, if you're thinking about initiating a major change program, if you have any initiative that's going to involve flowing work throughout the entire organization, do consider this survey, because what it does is it helps you assess the current state of readiness of your managerial workforce, and understands how effective they feel they are or not, and what some of the main opportunities you have for leveraging things that you're doing well, and opportunities for improving things that may not be working so well. In terms of effective managers, we also provide change management and implementation support. So if there are major change programs, we do provide support in that area. We're in agreement with Capel Associates for the provision of organization design services, and are very pleased to discuss that as well. And a fourth one, which we've recently added due to customer demand, as they say, but we have had requests from CEOs and senior executives in terms of providing an advisory or facilitation services around key issues that need to be addressed, or key problems that need to be solved. So very happy to talk with any of you about any of those services. Finally, I would encourage you to check out the upcoming webinar series. We've added to the list right through to the end of this year. So we will continue to have a webinar every 2 weeks, typically Wednesday afternoon. And we've thrown in one bonus webinar in the middle of December. I think it's on December 16th, looking at the change process and recognizing that many executives are thinking about launching major initiatives in the beginning of the next calendar year, and that a webinar on change process and readiness for that might be timely. So just to point out then, please do check out my website. It's loaded with free resources, some that do have a slight fee to them. You can also register for my monthly newsletter, and if you would like daily management tips, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at Dwight Mahalitz. Thank you very much for your close attention. As I predicted, I have gone right up to the minute in terms of the 30 minutes. I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you. If you have any questions, please do put them in the survey, which will pop up when we close this webinar, or feel free to be in contact with me by email. I would be delighted to talk with you. Thanks.